Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. Indeed, I'm working on a project that I initiated with Palmerio, to which Elisa and Caponera joined. And it's about studies that are conducted by INVALSI other than the national studies, but the participation of INVALSI in international studies. As we know, INVALSI is also taking place, it's participating in studies like PISA, like TALIS, but also the International Civic and Citizenship Education Study. You heard a little bit from Ellen earlier on about the ICCS study, so I'm not going to go into details, but I would like to make some points about it. Because Italy is particularly, has some characteristics for the studies that are really valuable. The study started in the 70s, and Italy had a part of it. It was the sixth object study. But it became a little bit more structured and organized in '99, and it evolved in 2009 and 2016. So you can see here that Italy participated in the last three waves, so there's a lot of potential in doing comparative analysis for different concepts. And what the studies measure, and it's very unique, and there are not many studies on youth that are doing that, is to look at other types of knowledge, not only mathematics and reading, but at civic knowledge, at attitudes such as tolerance or participation, political participation, so it can give a tremendous amount of information about other non-cognitive outcomes of learning. And one particular innovation that I would like to mention, that we have to thank Patrizia Falzetti for it, and it's the fact that in the latest wave of ICCS, it is possible to link these results with the INVALSI tests of mathematics and reading, so you can identify the same students participating in both ways, so there's a lot of potential in that. But what I want to tell you is what we started as a project based, focused on tolerance. And we had two parts in this project. The first one was initiated with Laura with the idea of looking at how Italy does in comparison with other European countries and seeing if we can compare attitudes towards immigrants, gender equality, and ethnic minorities in the European countries participating in ICCS. 2016, there were 14 European countries. And then we started thinking, and this is where Elisa joined, how can we compare across time? And we focused on the waves of 2009 and 2016, because this is, in this waves, the administration of the items was most similar. In the 99 wave, it was a little bit more difficult to have exactly the same content of the items. So I'm going to start with the first project, and we have a publication if you want to know more about it already on this first part. And why did we start thinking about tolerance? Well, I think we all know this is a necessity, especially nowadays. We are seeing quite a growth in intolerance in Europe, and it's a value that it's at the core of the European project. It's a value that education policies in Europe are trying to promote in schools, and there are talks about it, recent talks and all talks that are really focusing on this within the ET 2020, ET 2030 strategy and so on. So it has a very important role. And of course, it is particularly relevant in youth, and youth that are in school, youth that are still forming their opinions, youth that we know from research can be, through education, taught to take a certain position, to analyze critically, to relate to some groups. So they have a higher possibility of flexibility in developing such attitudes at a younger age rather than later in adulthood. And of course, we have some data. We have a lot of data at the European level, especially about adults. We have the Eurobarometers, we have the European social surveys. That is telling us something about adults. But when it comes about talking about young people, there are not actually many studies. We have the ICCS studies, and this is pretty much the most comprehensive source of information. So we wanted to take advantage of this. But of course, we are acknowledging that attitudes are very, very difficult to measure. And cross-national comparisons should not be taken for granted in this contest. So we try to focus on this in our work, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about it afterwards. I just wanted to first share with you where we start as a definition of tolerance found in the literature, and we looked at it as positive feelings towards different groups, as well as an understanding and endorsement of equality between these groups. And we found probably the most solid literature framework in the political sciences literature that is talking about the important distinction between political tolerance and social tolerance. In the sense that political tolerance, it's really relating to the fact that you are willing to grant rights to certain groups of people. And social tolerance is more an evaluation of direct contact with other people, like endorsing marriages between people of different nationalities and so on. And what we are looking at especially is political tolerance, because political tolerance is something that needs more critical thinking, of a higher level of abstractization. It may be that you do not necessarily like your neighbor, but you agree that he should be entitled to the same rights. So this is how ICCS Studies is looking at this concept. This is a three-dimensional construct. There are three scales looking into student attitudes towards equal rights for immigrants, equal rights for all ethnic and racial groups, and gender equality. And to give you an example of this, I have here the items on attitudes towards equal rights for immigrants. And you can see that they are generic rights, but also rights that are slightly more cultural, like the opportunity to continue own customs and lifestyles. So there's quite a different perspective in these scales, and you have the same situation when we're talking about attitudes towards ethnic minorities, similar items. And in the case of gender equality. In the case of gender equality, actually there is a combination between more generic rights and very specific things common to our society, like the right to have the same pay for the same job. So they're a little bit more tailored to the gender equality definition of the concept. And well, when we started this work, we looked at comparative studies, not only ICCS, but also PISA, also teens, parallel studies, and so on. And we want to compare different scales, and we want to talk about constructs and cross-country comparisons, but of course those cannot be taken for granted. And why? It's because we are talking about different contexts, we have different students, they may have different opinions. In their context, maybe one item may not be relevant, so they will not endorse it, or they may tend to score items in a different way. And for that reason, we have to be very careful and assess whether scales are comparable. But for a long time, we didn't really do it in the large-scale assessments, because all the time constructs were estimated across countries. So we had a confirmatory factor analysis, allowing us to generate some factor scores and to compare countries on that. And only recently, let's say in the last 10 years, there has been an increased concern about really looking at cross-cultural comparability, measurement invariance in other terms, and it's being implemented in most studies nowadays with different degrees. And it's still a complex field. There's a lot of simulation studies, and we do not really know, we do not have very clear guidelines. There are some guidelines, for example, in the work of Brown, on how to evaluate model fit in this kind of situations, but still, depending on how many countries, how many groups you have, if your data is categorical or not, if it's a multi-dimensional construct, and so on, different criteria apply. And there are many simulation studies ongoing right now that are changing a little bit the view on this. So we tried to take all this, at least the state of the art, into account when we did this, and also to do some robustness analysis. In this case was to also look at subgroups of countries that are culturally similar. And what did we do? This is for the first studies, we focused on the ICCS 216, as I was saying, and we applied the multiple group confirmatory factor analysis. And what we did in this framework was to really test if scales are comparable through a procedure that involves the comparisons of three models, the configural, metric, and scalar models. Well, in the configural model, we have a construct, and we assume and we test whether the same items load on the same constructs, that you do not have an item loading on two constructs, for example. In the metric case, we are further constraining that these item loadings are equal between groups or between countries in our case. And in the scalar case, we are also constraining the response probability of students, so we're constraining thresholds. And these models are being compared. There are quite a variety of fit indexes that I can discuss later if necessary. But only if the scalar invariance is achieved, we can say that we can compare means. In most cases, we stop at metric invariance, and in that case, we can say that we can look at the scores that we obtain, and we can look at their associations with other concepts across the cultures, but not necessarily, we cannot really accurately compare means and make inferences about that. So as we said, the model that we tested was a three-factor correlated model. And these are the results, yes. And just to show you, I'm not going to concentrate on the numbers, but what this slide is showing is according to several fit indices, like the root mean square error of approximation, the Tucker-Lewis index, and comparative fit index. We had a fit of the scalar model. Here I want to make a parenthesis because there are other indexes that you may use, but in our case, because we have data that is categorical, it's a 4-point scale, not many indexes can be used. So Bayesian statistics, for instance, are not available in this framework. And it's very similar to some degree with what we heard today about IRT modeling, about latent class modeling, so it's more of a categorical treatment of the data. And what we did, based on this model, we extracted the scores, and we transformed them back into the scale that was originally created for the ICCS study. And this is an example of the attitudes towards immigrants. And we wanted to illustrate here the averages. We always focus on averages, but also this dispersion. So that's why we have the 5th and 95th percentile here. Just to give an impression that although sometimes countries may score well on average, there's still variability, and maybe we can go further into that and investigate where is that variability situated, what are the background characteristics of those students, so we can eventually think of targeted interventions. So what you can see here is that we have some countries, of course, above the European average that we estimated in this case, and Italy is one of them, and some countries that are actually at a lower bottom, like Bulgaria, and a higher bottom, but they all are also showing quite a large distance between the lowest and the highest percentiles. And this is an impression of all the scales. I know that's very difficult to read, please do not concentrate on that, but this is to show that all the scales are highly related. So there is a very high association between attitudes toward immigrants' rights with attitudes toward ethnic minorities, that is to be expected, but to a certain degree also with gender equality. So in a practical terms, this is a good news. It means that if we want to endorse one of the values, we are maybe successful to reach farther. So for practitioners, this could be a good finding that we had. Now, recently we have been focusing on Italy and the two cohorts from 2009-2016, and we took a similar approach. We have, in 2009-2016, each wave roughly 3,000 students participated, which is quite a good number of students. And we specified the same three-factor correlated model. And these are the results. And here, unfortunately, we can see that we only reach the level of metric invariance, but not the scalar invariance. What this is saying is that we can eventually use both data and relate it to other background characteristics like gender, like socioeconomic status, and so on, but we cannot really make strong inferences about changes between 2009 and 2016. And of course, we have to reflect on why that is the case. And I'm really hoping we're going to take some hints from you today. And I will start with this last point first, and because there are several ways to go from here. We can just stop and say we cannot compare. Then from a methodological point of view, we can just go back to the items and see where are the problems. We can take a partial measurement invariance approach, look a little bit at the modification indexes, see a little bit if there are differences in item loadings and item thresholds and so on. But this will be a little bit more exploratory. The other part that can be done, and it's a little bit more qualitative in nature, is really trying to understand if there was something into the cultural context of these two time points that could have made students to answer to some question in a different way, to understand it in a different way, and maybe to rate it in a different way. So this is something that we can still focus on. And of course, for the ICCS 2016 data, there's tremendous possibilities because we could establish this comparison with other European countries. And this is not easily achievable based on all other surveys. It's quite a good finding. And there we can go farther to explore relationships with other variables to understand what are the factors between tolerant attitudes and so on. And with this I finish, and I think I was fast, right? I know you have to go to dinner soon, so. But I'm looking forward to your questions and comments and